Section 1 of the Science History of the Universe, Volume 2. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Eric Metzler, Albuquerque, USA. The Science History of the Universe, Volume 2, edited by Francis Rolt-Wheeler. Geology. Chapter 1. The Ancient Cosmogonies. Part 1. This earth whereon man lives, by which he has his being and to which he returns, was to the ancients a riddle inexplicable. What mighty hand, they wondered, could have upreared the mountain peaks whose glittering summits pierced the very clouds? What fearsome figure lurked in the volcanic forge where subterranean rumblings seemed to tell of life within? What stupendous power could evoke from nowhere the shrieking tempest which destructively could mock the puny efforts of the world of men? Answers there must be, and the beginnings of geology are the cosmogonies devised by inexact observation and by fancy to propound a suitable reply. The earliest efforts at the interpretation of nature found their expression in the mythologies and cosmogonies of primitive peoples, which varied in type from country to country, according to the climate and other physical conditions under which they had their birth. Geological speculation may thus be said to be traceable in the mental conceptions of the remotest pre-scientific ages. Among these first gropings after truth, the Babylonian account of the creation holds an honored place, not only by reason of its completeness, but also because modern knowledge of it is gained from tablets of extreme antiquity, tablets which in themselves hold high rank in the records of historical importance. With the Babylonians, creation begins with chaos. The gods arose before heaven and earth had taken shape, while the tumultuous floods of oceans were still intermingled in the universal chaos. The gods chose Marduk to be their champion against Tiamat, the disturbing, chaotic ocean flood. Marduk armed himself with lightning flash and thunderbolt and called the winds to his assistance. Marduk vanquished Tiamat and divided his corpse into two parts. From the one part he created the heavens, and from the other the earth and the sea. Marduk peopled the heavens with stars, the dwellings of the great gods. Then followed the creation of plants and animals, and finally the creation of the two first human beings out of clay. The Mosaic account of the creation far excels the Babylonian in its noble simplicity and in the strength and beauty of the language. In it the origin of the world, of the earth and its inhabitants, is represented as the work of a personal God. The Mosaic account, which is especially distinguishable among early cosmogonies by its recognition of the existence of light before the actual orb of the sun was visible, due to dense aqueous atmosphere, was incorporated in the Bible of the Christian Church, and, unfortunately, became invested with a scientific value which was mistakenly embroiled with the idea of verbal inspiration and infallibility. This retarded the development of geology for many centuries, inasmuch as theologians regarded the Mosaic account as a divine revelation and sought to suppress any investigations and writings of scientific interest which did not harmonize with their interpretation of it. The Greeks were less inclined than the Oriental nations to interweave the ideas of mythology, religion, and science. They viewed natural events from a more critical standpoint and treated them as subjects of philosophical speculation. In their early Ionian days, however, their understanding of the cosmogony was comparatively primitive, though heightened and made of interest by the imaginative force with which they peopled that portion of the earth's surface which was remote to them. Homer's contributions to ancient geography were large and curious, but cosmogonical ideas do not seem to have occurred to him. he presupposed that the earth was flat, and that the sun truly sank into the sea. Hesiod, in his Theogony, tells of the birth of the world, and time, Chronos. He describes the wars of the older and the Olympian gods, but he seems to have accepted the prevalent conception of the world as a flat disk with Greece at the center. These early cosmogonies, while differing greatly in style, elaboration of detail, and the degree to which they expressed the conceit of the author, had certain points in common. They all agree on successive alternate creations and destructions of the world. These speculations were closely interwoven with their religion, as were all the sciences, and the destructions were supposed to come when man's sin had become intolerable to the then ruling deity. The following creation included a race of men free from sin and taint of all kinds, who immediately proceeded to gradually degenerate. In the Institutes of Menu, the sacred volume of the Hindus, is the following verse: "There are creations also and destruction of worlds innumerable. The being supremely exalted performs all this with as much ease as if in sport, again and again, for the sake of conferring happiness." There are at the same time such puerile conceits and monstrous absurdities in this cosmogony, says Sir Charles Lyell in his famous Principles of Geology, that some may be disposed to impute to mere accident any slight approximation to truth or apparent coincidence between the Oriental dogmas and observed facts. This pretended revelation, however, was not purely an effort of the unassisted imagination, nor invented without regard to the opinions and observations of naturalists. There are introduced into it certain astronomical theories, evidently derived from observation and reasoning. Thus, for instance, it is declared that, at the North Pole, the year was divided into a long day and night, and that their long day was the northern, and their night the southern course of the sun. And to the inhabitants of the moon, it is said, one day is equal in length to 1 month of mortals. The Brahmins and Chinese corroborated this notion of successive creations and destructions, and also described a great flood. Plutarch tells us that this was the subject of one of the famous hymns of Orpheus. In his verses he sets a definite period for each cycle or life of a world. Orpheus assigned 120,000 years, while Cassandra took it to be 360,000 years. The Egyptian priests were aware not only that the soil beneath the plains of the Nile, but also that the hills bounding the great valley contained marine shells, and it could hardly have escaped the observation of Eastern philosophers that some soils were filled with fossil remains, since so many national works requiring extensive excavations were executed by Oriental monarchs in very remote eras. Thales of Miletus, the contemporary of Croesus and Cyrus, who considered that everything, animate and inanimate, was derived from water, added but little to early cosmology, save that his theory presupposed a condition of constant flux. His gifted scholar, Anaximander, circa 611 B.C., arrived at a higher conception of nature. He depicted an infinite, all-pervading primeval substance, possessing an inherent power of movement from the first. The energy of this primeval matter determined heat and cold, and the mixture of these conditions gave origin to the development of fluid. The earth, the air, and a surrounding circle of fire differentiated from the fluid state. The stars sprang from fire and air. The earth rested in the center of the whole universe, and, under the influence of the sun, brought forth the animals which inhabit it. These, including human beings, were at first fish-like in form, consistent with the semi-fluid state of their environment. Xenophanes of Colophon, 614 B.C., is reported by later writers to have observed the shell remains of pelagic mollusca on mountains in the middle of the land, impressions of laurel leaves in the rocks of Paros, as well as various evidences of the former presence of the sea on the ground of Malta, and to have attributed those appearances to periodic invasions of the sea, during which men and their dwellings must have been submerged. The historian Xanthus of Sardis, circa 500 B.C., also drew attention to the occurrence of fossil shells in Armenia, Phrygia, and Lydia, far from the sea, and concluded that the localities where such remains occur had been formerly the bed of the ocean, and that the limits of the dry land in the ocean were constantly undergoing change. Herodotus, 484 B.C., mentioned the presence of fossil shells of marine bivalves in the mountains of Egypt and near the oasis of Ammon. From this fact, as well as from the salt constitution of the rocks, Herodotus formed the opinion that Lower Egypt had been at one time covered by the sea, and that the material carried down by the Nile had been discharged into the sea basin between Thebes and Memphis and the current delta, and gradually filled it up. Herodotus could not form any definite opinion as to the cause of the Nile inundations, although he gave a careful report of the hypothesis then in favor. The gorge of Tempe, previously referred to, also came under the notice of the father of history. He says that the gorge of Tempe was caused by Poseidon is probable. At least one who attributes earthquakes and chasms to that god would say that this gorge was his work. It seemed to me to be quite evident that the mountains had there been torn asunder by an earthquake. Heraclitus, 535 B.C., thought there was in the universe nothing stable, nothing lasting. Everything was in a state of constant change, like a stream in which new waves endlessly supplant the old. For him fire was the primeval force which unceasingly transformed itself, pervaded every portion of the universe, produced individuals and again destroyed them. Fire became the ocean, and that again earth, and the breath of life. The rising vapors burned in the air and formed the sun, which was renewed from day to day. Thus Heraclitus taught that although the universe always had been, and always would be, no portion of it had ever been quiescent, and that from time to time a new world was constructed out of the old. Pythagoras, who was born at Samos about the year 582 B.C. and afterward went to Crotona in Italy, is one of those eminent leaders of thought around whose name and teaching much that is mythical has gathered. His followers, suggests Carl von Zittel in his History of Geology and Paleontology, sought to explain natural phenomena chiefly by analogy with definite numerical relationships. An ordered universe depended, according to the Pythagoreans, upon the principle of numbers. According to Diogenes Laertius, Pythagoras imagined the universe in the form of a sphere. The earth was in the center, and bore the axis around which the firmament revolved. The principle of constant change taught by Pythagoras and Heraclitus was also a leading feature in the doctrines of Empedocles of Agrigentum, 492 to 432 B.C. Empedocles supposed that everything had its origin in, and took its components from, four elements: earth, water, air, and fire. That these elements were without beginning and imperishable, but subject to never-ending change. From these elements the world at one time took shape, and it must at some future time be again dispersed. The course of the world's existence resolved itself into a history of recurring periods and phases. Geology owes one distinct step in advance to this philosopher. Whereas the Pythagoreans had conjectured the presence of a central fire in the universe, Empedocles taught that the earth's center was composed of molten material. Empedocles formed this opinion on the basis of his actual observation of the volcanic activities of Mount Etna. Tradition says that he met his death by falling into the crater of that volcano. Plato, 427 B.C., in his Cosmology, is a follower partly of Heraclitus and partly of Anaxagoras. According to Plato, the universe is the production of divine intelligence and of the necessary development of nature. The form of the whole universe is spherical. In the center lies the earth as a motionless sphere. An interesting account is given in the Timaeus of a submerged Atlantic continent, Atlantis, on the other side of the Pillars of Hercules, Gibraltar. The idea of such a submerged continent has again and again received credence. In Plato's account Atlantis was larger than Asia and Libya together. It had been inhabited 9,000 years before his time, and since its destruction by earthquakes and inundations, navigation in the Atlantic had been impossible owing to the fine mud and detritus left by the vanished land. Another of Plato's theories related to the origin of rivers. He attributed them to a common underground source. End of section 1. Recording by Eric Metzler, Albuquerque, USA, August 2015.